and I will go over some of the week's most important news coming out of the China EV, AV, and mobility sectors. We will open the room up at around the 40-minute mark to anyone who's keen to ask us any questions. We have one rule: although we appreciate vigorous debate, let's all be considerate and respectful to each other. What Lei and I discussed today is based on our opinions and should not be taken as investment advice. Even if it sounds like investment advice, it isn't. We encourage those who enjoy this room to please connect with us on Clubhouse, LinkedIn, follow us on Twitter, and of course, tune in again next week. My name is Tu Li, and I'm the Managing Director at Sino Auto Insights, a Beijing-based consultancy that helps organizations bring innovative and tech-focused products and services to the transportation and mobility sectors. I write a free weekly newsletter that we pull many of our discussion topics from. You can sign up for it at sinoautoinsights.com, which of course, I encourage you all to do. Lei, can you please introduce yourself?
And good evening from my side. My name is Lei Xing, and I am the former chief editor of China Auto Review, which published newsletters and the only tabloid magazine in English focused exclusively on the Chinese auto market. I've spent pretty much the last 20 years on the ground in China covering the industry. I am now in the US as an independent analyst consultant, still trying to keep tabs on the rapidly evolving market. This week, we're talking, since the last episode, NIO, Stellantis, and Volkswagen Group have announced ambitious new electrification strategies. What are the implications for China? We've seen some new NEV sales targets for 2025, and they're way out of this world. So for dough or for show? WM Motor tries to be relevant. Leap Motor trying to leap ahead. And more. Let's start out with Volkswagen.
Right on. Let's talk about Volkswagen Group's announcements from this week. First, they had talked about New Auto, which is the name for their strategy through 2030. It's a new plan that's going to transform Volkswagen Group into a software-driven mobility company, quote unquote. And there are three pillars to this strategy. The first being software, second being electrification, and the third being autonomous vehicles. So with the software, they've developed or they've created an entity called Caria. It's going to be the centralized software development department for their entire lineup of brands. So it's going to be leveraged by Porsche, Audi, Volkswagen brand, Skoda, and the rest of the brands that they have under the Volkswagen Group. The electrification portion we already know about. It's going to be driven by the ID, at least in the Volkswagen brand. And they're selling currently the ID4, ID3, ID6, the Taycan here, and the e-tron for Audi. And then autonomous vehicles, they've began testing autonomous vehicles here in Hefei, I know, and in the EU and the US, they've hitched their wagon to an autonomous vehicle company that they've invested in with Ford Motor Company called Argo AI. So I think that's pretty clear. A few statistics that I'd like to throw out that shout out at me were 20% of their vehicle sales by 2025 should be NEVs, 50% by 2030, and nearly 100% by 2040. So that's going to be largely driven by China, the EU, and the United States, of course, because they operate in more than 100 different countries. There will be also some lagging countries that are late to the game for EV adoption. And there's always weasel words because Volkswagen Group sells in many markets. So like in South America, in India, and certain markets that are probably going to lag a bit on EV adoption, either because of government policy or because of cost structures and things like that. I think there needs to be those weasel words, but for all intents and purposes, he's referring to the US, to China, and the EU market, I think. So
Yeah, these are the three of their major markets. But, the thing is for VW, they're coming from obviously a laggard position, right?
Mm-hmm.
They are the ones now catching up. In the traditional ICE, they're the leader, right? At least in China, they're the leader.
Yes.
They have a 20% market share there. They have a 4% market share in the US, which they want to grow to 10%, in the long run.
But you and I know that they've been wanting to do that forever in the United States. So
Yeah, it looks like they will announce a separate EV plan for the US. I think it's basically going to be more EV models, more local production, same as what they're doing in China. But the thing is, right, it will be a lot harder for VW to grab that 20% market share in the NEV space than what they already enjoy in the ICE space in China.
right.
And same here in the US. In Europe, they're a bit better, right? Their target was, 75% will probably be EVs in Germany alone by 2030.
Mm-hmm.
So I think, looking at what VW has been doing over the last 5 or 6 years or so under Dees, from the moment he stepped into the role as VW brand CEO to later on as group CEO, I think the whole point was to shed its image from the Dieselgate,
Right.
right?
And we have to highlight that there was a power struggle months ago, and he actually was demoted out of the brand CEO position, but he still retained the group CEO position for VW. So I think that's worth noting.
Yeah, there's the power struggles. There's the Dieselgate, lingering effect. Right? They just got fined last week, right? Daimler and
$1 billion.
right, together, for hopefully that's the last of it. And they're facing, obviously, as we talked many times, kind of hurdles and roadblocks ramping up EV sales in China and the US, right?
Mm-hmm.
I was looking at this. So PwC, they had this digital automotive roundtable this afternoon or this noon US time with, Daimler's Ola Kalenius, Willem Lee of NIO, Continental CEO, one of the board members of Volkswagen Group. And it just felt like, NIO is not the underdog. These traditional OEMs, they're the underdog. It felt like. Right?
Without question.
It feels like this baggage on them, this monkey, that they haven't been able to get off their shoulder. So
it's amazing how NIO at 47,000 vehicles sold last year is really dictating to these big guys how the market is moving, right? There's a ton of excitement about NIO entering Norway. Volkswagen can't get that type of excitement about any new vehicle launches, right? And to your point earlier about Battery Day and earlier this week's conference, it's just a continuation on what they announced on Battery Day. So not much new. The one thing that stood out to me, and it should pay them dividends without question, is their 13% of revenue being invested into CapEx and R&D. That will eventually pay off, right? And, I've gotten some feedback that I'm super negative on Volkswagen. So I want to clarify that they're going to still sell millions of cars around the world. I'm not saying they're going to go out of business. So if you guys got that impression, or some of you got that impression, that's not what I'm saying at all. I believe that, at the premium end, they have some amazing vehicles. They are tripping over themselves a bit. And I think that at a time when, to your point about this digital roundtable, how they sounded like underdogs a little bit, in the same vein, Dees is saying we should catch up to Tesla by 2025. I don't even know if that should even be a goal of theirs, right? Because, I just think that's not super important for them to right the ship or to take the right step into the EV sector. There's a ton going on at VW, 13%, that's billions and billions of euros. And so they're going to eventually get it, right? But will it be too late? And and I know the competition for ICEs in China with VW with the commanding 20% market share, when you're starting off at zero, it's really, it took them over 30 years to build 20% market share. And so, again, to your point, when they're starting off at zero and everybody's at zero, it's really difficult because they don't have that advantage of scale. They don't have that advantage of trust in the market not on the EV side, right? In the United States and the EU, they actually have a burden of Dieselgate kind of as a dark cloud hanging over their head. And so they have to get past that. But again, I want to emphasize that they're still going to sell millions of vehicles. They have to right size. I don't know how big they're going to be in the future, but they have to be smaller than they are now. It doesn't allow them to be as nimble as they need to be.
Yeah.
And if you're, go ahead.
No, I mean, you hit the nail on the head, nimble. Or another word that I would describe what they're trying to do is, simplicity, simplify everything. So basically one platform, right? SSP, one software OS, the E3 2.0, one unified cell, make sure they got all their cell supply, 6 gigas. And it was interesting that they're banking on, Gotion, right? Gotion is a company that they own 20% in to provide technical, help for one of their gigas and to develop the unified cell with Gotion. And they explained, that Gotion first, it was good on LFP, right? And two was that they have their own cathode supply as well. Mm-hmm. And it seems like they're all big on Gotion. And although they do also have supply partnerships with CATL, but it looks like Gotion is a very strategic play for them, at least for the Giga factories.
You know that part of that is to mitigate that risk, right? Of CATL being such an important partner for them. No one on the OEM side really wants to be single sourcing such an important part. And so that's one of the reasons that Gotion is going to be qualified as a battery supplier, I think. And the third dimension is that they have also invested in Northvolt, right, and QuantumScape. So there are two other bets that they're making, which they have to. These are risks because with Northvolt and QuantumScape specifically, we're talking newer technology. But they're putting a lot of faith in Northvolt to be a major partner for them in Europe. And I think they will try to get away from a CATL and Gotion perhaps in 6-7 years if Northvolt can come through on quality, reliability, and capacity. And so will they have a different U.S. strategy for batteries? Probably, right? But because it's going to be easier to localize battery manufacturers, especially when they have huge manufacturing presence in all three regions, right? Because they build a lot of cars in the U.S. as well. So,
and it's also interesting to compare, the charging strategies, right? So Tesla's got the supercharger network. Volkswagen is banking on their different partners in different regions, right? CAMS in China, Electrify America here, and then working with several...
Which they help fund.
Right, working with several players in Europe, and their bet on high power charging, right? How many, 10,000 stations in the US, I think it was 17 or 18,000 in China, chargers. And NIO, on the other hand, right, we saw what they announced there. I was doing some math. The day they announced their power, that was a week ago, of 4,000 globally battery swap stations by 2025. That day they had 301 swapping stations.
Yep.
And today, as of today, that number is 310. And by the end of the year, they wanted to get it 700, which means they're going to be adding more than 2 a day for the rest of the year. That's crazy. And
I'm going to throw this out there, Lei. It sounds like when Luckin was growing, right? We're going to grow from 0 to 10,000 coffee shops in a year, right? It's like, that means like 5 Luckins a day. So that's crazy. That's a craziness.
And I thought it was smart that they, this came up with the users, the so-called swap station district house. For those who don't know what that means, this came out of the school district house. In Chinese, it's 学区房. You know about it. I know about it personally because when my daughter went to school in Beijing, to go to a certain school, you had to own a certain, property, or you have to be in that specific district. So as of now, I'm still paying off a mortgage on a apartment. It's about 9,000 a month renminbi, and I don't know how long. I think maybe 13 or 12 more years left. so so in order to go to a certain school, you have to have a school district housing. So now they want to have this swap station district housing where the users, by 2025, 90% of the users will be living within 3 kilometers of a swap station. So this is
That's
yeah,
bananas. It's just
bananas.
bananas.
And 1,000 overseas by 2025, which means over the next 4 years, this is going to span out dramatically over in Europe. Because Norway next, it's got to be one of these, Netherlands, right? Eventually Germany. There's no doubt about it.
And the thing is, what would be interesting to see, Lei, is their urban density calculation for vehicle sales. Because in Beijing and Shanghai and the tier 1 cities, even some of these tier 2 cities that have 10, 11 million people, it's you could put a swap station in the middle of downtown or Third Ring Road, and chances are there's going to be enough NIO customers or NIO drivers to keep that swapping station at a fairly high utilization rate, right? But
they
these
listed
countries,
a few cities where currently more than 50% of users already in those cities are within 3 kilometers away of a battery swap station. In fact, where I worked in Beijing, my office building, they were building a swap station right next to it. And I was like, I got to get a NIO because every day if I needed to, recharge or swap, I just, it's right next to the office, but,
and think about this. When they talk to their real estate team, they must look at the availability of land or space for a swapping station in order to determine where to put a retail station, right?
Well,
Remember,
right? They have a deal with Sinopec.
Yes.
So I'm sure those 3,000, at least in China, at least quite a few of the new ones will be, near those, gas stations. So that's one way to solve it, right?
Should we assume that they're working, and forgive me if I don't know this and it's been announced, but should we assume that they are working with some European petroleum companies on partnerships similar to the Sinopec, or they're negotiating behind the scenes currently? Because
I think you're absolutely right. I agree.
Because 1,000 seems like a pretty significant number, especially when I did this statistic where there's over 100 cities in China with over 150, I think, cities in China with 1 million people. I think there is less than 16 or 18 in the EU currently with 1 million people. So the NIO buyers in the early years would need to be very clustered together, right? And so I think where they're going to be launching in Oslo, obviously, is a population center for Norway. But
right. So their plan is 4 this year in Oslo, the swap stations, and then 5 next year in other parts of Norway. So that's almost 10 out of the way, and then you have 990 to go.
We have a few finance guys in the room. That makes for a nasty looking balance sheet. Somebody's balance sheet is holding all those batteries, right? And holding all that CapEx. So, because it can't be just NIO buying and holding those batteries and having them amortized on their balance sheet. So,
well, that's why they have the joint venture with CATL, right? The asset company to,
Oh, man. So, but back to VW, there wasn't anything that surprised you from that conference or the PR event this week, right? Not so much?
No, VW, they're doing I think they're doing an event today interviewing their China CEO. So I'm sure there will be some...
Wallenstein, right?
Wallenstein, yeah. Who I, used to, on various occasions, many occasions, I've spoken to him, formally and informally. So I think they will address the ID4 problem. They're pretty open about it, at least from what I know. And it looks like it'll be interesting what they going to do. I mean, they're still launching the ID3, which is it's a Golf, right? It's a Golf-sized EV. I don't know how that's going to do.
I
But
think they're still hopeful that the ID6 is
yeah,
going
yeah.
to turn it around.
I mean, it's ramping up, and I heard the numbers are looking good so far. But like we say all the time in this room is let's span it in a longer period of time rather than just looking at right 1 month of numbers, 2 months of
Right on.
numbers.
Right
And
on.
let's see by the end of the year where they stand.
Well,
Right?
I think you and I can agree on a couple truisms that Tesla's always going to pretty much sell around 25 to 30,000 units at least a month. I think the Wuling Hongguang is also going to sell around 25, 30,000 units, and then everything.
Yeah,
So,
and I think the surprise this year was a bit of a shuffle in the what I call the contenders, right? You remember that list of June insurance numbers?
Yep.
Where Li Auto was at the top, right? And then 1 to 6, they were all over at least 1,000 units, and then the 7 through 10 were a few hundred units. And Leap Motor is the one actually trying to leap ahead of some of these players. And so the big bomb they dropped today was 800,000 units in 2025. In the first half, I think they sold just over 10,000 units. But they said this year their second half will be, well, they said this year their total sales are projected to be 64,000 units, which is pretty significant.
Yeah, that's a pretty good number.
Yeah.
And it's being driven by their T03, right? T03.
T03, yep.
It's effectively a little bit bigger than the Hongguang Mini EV, but it's twice as much from a pricing standpoint. It's about 65,000 RMB. So these microcars, these affordable microcars are really driving volume.
Well, banking on the C11, which is the model that they're launching soon, and they're supposed to get that model is more like a compact to mid-size SUV. Maybe
still affordable.
Yeah, still affordable. And the 800,000 in 2025, and then 8 new models from all the way to 350,000 RMB, which is the price point of currently about the Li Auto 1. So very ambitious, and I think the thing to point out is people don't know that Leap Motor is also one of the very vertically integrated players in the industry, because their parent company Dahua is the world's second largest video surveillance equipment supplier. And you see where I'm getting at? And that's why they're doing their own vision hardware. Everything from cameras to LiDARs. They're launching LiDAR equipped models in 2023, and they do their own chips.
And I think that's where we've kind of placed emphasis, because effectively they're just entering complementary markets and segments, right? These technology companies are very good at one or two things, and then they say, you know what, we can be a difference maker if we build EVs and emphasize this technology that we're a leader in. And so, Leap Motor, for those that don't know, Leap Motor was started with a really, really, really small coupe that was
SO1.
less than 10 or 12,000 US dollars, that didn't
the
sell
SO1.
well at all. Yes, it's a cute little car that didn't sell at all, and they quickly followed that up with a T03, which has become pretty popular. And they've just announced, I think 2 days ago, $700 million of investment coming from current investors, readying themselves for an IPO on the Shanghai Star Board, which is similar to NASDAQ, and by the end of this year. So let's see how the valuation comes out at. But again, to your point, Lei, they came from nowhere at the beginning of this year to really take some significant share. So good for them.
Yeah, and similar for WM Motor, who's also has also been preparing for the Starboard listing, but it's it's dragged on a bit, and that's why there was a recent kind of a scathing report about them not doing well. So they organized a mid-year media press conference yesterday, where Freeman Shen, whom I know very well from his Borg Warner days back in the early 2000s,
right?
He said this. I'm a big soccer fan. I watched the Euro 2020 championships. It's only 15 minutes into the first half. We still have 45 minutes. No, not 45 minutes. We still have 75 minutes to go. So don't write us off.
and that's a fair statement.
So
obviously.
But their sales, they're in danger of not selling more than Leap Motor. And WM Motor was one of the top three in the early days of
4 years ago. 4 years ago. Yep.
They sold about 15,000 in the first half, and they received, from what Freeman said, they received 100,000, 10,000 orders for the W6, which you saw personally a couple of months ago, right, in one of the events you attended. So, and they're launching their M7 sedan with LiDAR. So all this race on production cars with LiDARs.
I think you'd mentioned 3 versus 2, right, on the P5, right?
Yeah, so you will have 3 LiDARs. I think similar to the ArcFox Alpha S, which also has 3.
Which is peculiar because I don't think the W6 has any LiDAR, and it has the Apollo Smart Parking feature, right? The ANP, I think it's called. So, you would think they would have complementary hardware software stacks, but there must be a method to the madness. I think the W6 is going to do better than their current crossover SUVs in the market. I think it's a bit more. I think it's better designed. Has the feature set that people want. But can you also expand a bit on that article you had sent me about some of the management team having left the company recently?
Yeah, I think their CTO and one of their people in charge of marketing left.
And their chief growth officer too, right?
So they've had some senior executive churn. And I think the most telling sign was so far this year. Remember, at the beginning of every month, the first or the second of every month, you will see these smart EV startups publish posters of their sales numbers, right?
Yep.
Bar charts. And we've never seen WM Motor do that this year. So it might have been, this quiet period from their, starboard preparations. But, it just felt weird and strange.
Yeah.
That
and
all of a sudden they don't announce numbers anymore.
And we should note really quickly that WM took a completely different tack to launching vehicles than XPeng and NIO. And they had spent a ton of capital and got a lot of tax subsidies and discounts from Wenzhou province or Wenzhou city to build factories. So they own their factories, whereas XPeng and NIO, which in hindsight perhaps created a bit more flexibility with their capital, they decided initially to outsource manufacturing. And so I think that obviously will influence your strategy if you have $1 billion or $500 million committed to building out a factory versus operating expense of buying at a wholesale price a vehicle that you sell to the market. So I think that's worth noting that WM just had a different strategy initially than an XPeng and a NIO. So I don't know if that made it difficult for them to really market aggressively their brand and their vehicles, but it's something to consider.
Well, I think the surprising thing was for who Freeman was, right?
Mm-hmm.
He was an old traditional car guy. He was the Borg Warner China president for many years. And then he played a crucial role when Geely bought Volvo.
Mm-hmm.
He was part of the negotiation team, and he was, heading Volvo Asia Pacific. And their strategy was to have their own plant, to build their own plant rather than contract manufacturing. So I think the surprising thing was you had the experience of Freeman, of the CEO, but it did not work as well as it should have, maybe, with all this experience, from both sides of the equation, right? Being the OEMs and as well as supplier, and the experience of working at multiple brands and companies. So they seem to be a bit slow also on their product iterations. Although
Yes.
W6 is their their fourth model,
Yes,
a third,
EX5,
the third
EX6.
model,
Yes,
third model, and the M7 sedan will be their fourth model. And
because
another
they did come out with that Maven concept, so
right,
that was a
and
concept vehicle.
remember also this, another thing that is different with WM Motor than the other ones is when they started off, they put a lot of their vehicles into a fleet in Hainan
Fleet,
province, which Will knows about. He rented one a few weeks ago, and that was not part of the strategy for the other players.
right?
Putting this on the ride sharing or ride hailing platform.
But I have to speculate because maybe that was a bit of a requirement because they did own their factory and they needed it to be running, right? Maybe that was why they did that, as
Yeah,
opposed to
and also
contract manufacturing. They didn't need to. They didn't need to with contract manufacturers. You don't need to be building because they're not your employees. You pay a penalty, but not near as much as a factory that's not running vehicles, right?
yeah, and if you also compare with just looking at these brands, what is NIO known for? What is Xpeng known for? What is Li Auto known for? What is WM Motor known for? It's not as clear, right? NIO is all about service. Xpeng is all about their own autonomous driving technology. Li Auto is everything standard, one price, everything standard. And W Motor, the prices are not that high. Price performance is pretty good, but they don't have that one thing that stand out that draw the users.
Yeah.
So I don't know.
In
Maybe
general,
that's
in general terms, it's just not distinct positioning within the market, right?
Well, I mean, their
'Cause-
positioning was cheap, smart SUVs for everyone. But I think part of it was a few quality issues before they started delivery, or soon after they started delivery. Around the time they started delivering, toward the end of 2018, there was a fire on one of the mule vehicles.
Right.
I think that was one sort of impact that they faced, and then there was a few more fires their vehicles. So there's quality issue. There's a bit of iteration of their products. But like Freeman said, it's 15 minutes of the first half. So
and we should also emphasize that they're a 5-year-old company, 6-year-old company, so they're still very young. So it's not surprising that there would be some management turnover. That's not worth pressing the panic button for, but how quickly they can get back on the horse, whether this M7 is going to be a competitive product. The first few months of W6, once it ramps, let's look at sales volume on that. I think to Freeman's point, determining what their next big moves are and how successful and how much the market embraces them, I think it'll be a good indication of how healthy they're going to be moving forward. So
yeah, the top three, the NIO, Xpeng, Li Auto, they're all listed here. I think for the rest of the players, not only in the smart EV sector, but the other tech sectors,
AV.
foreseeable future, it will be Starboard. Not even Hong Kong, because Hong Kong, I mean, Xpeng got onto Hong Kong, but Hong Kong also has this quite strict regulatory requirements, right, for public listing. So
that most of the current startups would not meet.
Yeah.
So
yeah, and I guess the only other thing that we would mention today is Stellantis. We talked slightly about it, but the only thing was huge, I thought, was bringing Opel back to China as a electric brand.
Yeah, that Manta E is cool looking, super cool looking.
I mean, Opel is actually, being a German brand, has its aura, right? Actually, it was quite a huge following when they were on the market. Although, I mean, they never sold more than 5,000 units a year in China, but they haven't announced a timing when they're going to bring the Opel back to China. But at least we do know that by 2028, it will be a pure electric brand in Europe. So I'm thinking certainly sometime before that. But
So I'm going to say this really quickly, Lei. Right now, they have way too many brands. 14. I'm going to call them out. I'm going to call them out right now. Okay, Dodge, Ram, Jeep, Peugeot, Abarth, Fiat, Alfa Romeo, Lancia, Maserati, Opel, Vauxhall, Chrysler, Citroen, and DS.
yeah,
Way too many.
yeah.
So I understand, because Citroen and DS, Lancia, Opel, Vauxhall, they don't sell in the United States. So maybe there's a decent market for them in Europe. But, to be quite frank, it's the U.S. brands, it's the Dodge, it's the Jeeps that bring in a lot of their profit. So if they don't have a significant plan for those brands, it could be quite a struggle, right? Because I think it was cool because I went to it really quickly. The current Jeep, the only Jeep that they have is the 4xe, which is a hybrid. Okay, and they're not going to have an EV for the Jeep brand for another 2 or 3 years. So in the China market, which is, because this, Great Wall is nipping on their heels to become the China Jeep, right? Jeep brand kind of thing. So,
well, it's interesting that the Jeep Wrangler 4xe is the top-selling plug-in hybrid in the U.S. and they're trying to, I think, at least they just launched that in China. So, but for many years, FCA in China was about Jeep. I mean, Fiat failed miserably.
Yeah.
Twice. Right. And it's about Jeep. So in the first half, the joint venture with FCA, GAC FCA, I think they sold like 11,000 units in the first half of this year. Peugeot and Citroen are doing better. That's all, PSA in China. DS is now under Baoneng, right? They sold, Peugeot Citroen, they sold about 50,000 units. So if you look at these numbers, that's why Carlos Tavares was, my priority is stop the red ink in China. And then we worry about other things.
I remember he has also announced when he kind of took on the role that they would get rid of $5 billion worth of expenses in the next year or year and a half or something like that. So he's got a lot of cost cutting to do. And if we are keeping score, Ford has announced earlier this year $25.5 billion of investment by 2025 to digitize and transform their product lineup into mostly EVs. GM is at 35 billion US by 2025, and Tavares announced last week that they would be at 35.5 or 36 billion US. So huge numbers from these guys. Volkswagen, I think, announced over 80 billion US.
73 billion euros. Yeah.
Yes.
Over $80 billion. Yeah.
So Daimler also announced like a 70-something, $80 billion number.
Well, Daimler, they will announce a updated electrification strategy next Thursday. Mercedes-Benz, at least, which I think they will address probably this 2035 ban.
Yeah.
I'm sure they're going to come out with a new target or something similar.
And it's worth noting, Lei, that like you'd mentioned earlier, these guys probably saw it coming. They probably had some influence on the announcement of when, but that now that it's official, the teams in Wolfsburg, the teams in Stuttgart, and the NIO team, the Xpeng team, the WM team, all the Chinese EV makers, their strat teams are at their headquarters saying, okay, we need to be more aggressive now because 2035 means that there is a line in the sand where it's not open-ended. So if we can quickly get into the EU market and get some share, it's going to be beneficial to us, right? Maybe we'll see the China EV companies try to raise more capital in order to accelerate their entry into the EU market. That would be my guess.
Yeah, and if I was the CEO of these traditional big giants, I would be very worried in the sense that when we talk about 2030, 2035, it's what, 14 years away?
It's
That's not
nothing. It's
it's not
nothing.
that long of a time concerning the age we're in. I mean, I've been here, I tweeted the other day, I've been in the US 18 months already. And I was talking to someone back, also in Beijing. We talk about this pandemic. If we count how it might have started at the end of 2019, we're almost 2 years into this pandemic. And it's probably going to take about 5 years for everything to be settled. And by
I'm
then,
hopeful.
it will already be almost 2025. And you look at these numbers, right? That's why I tweeted, these four companies are announcing these huge sales numbers, not that many years away. So how are you going to get there?
Well, and that's the thing, and that's the thing. You have to admit that these numbers, a lot of them don't make sense, right, from a practical standpoint.
So that's what I was saying. Either the predictions of the overall aggregate sales numbers are wrong, or these guys are smoking. They're smoking something, right?
Yeah.
So I think we're seeing this converging. So let's say NIO, when are they going to sell 1 million EVs a year? And let's look at VW. They're going to sell 1.5 million in China in 2025. Who's going to get to 1 million first? Where will the convergence be? Or will NIO even get there? Right? These are the questions that we can debate on.
And this is with the known knowns, okay? We do know that it's going to be a technology war, right? And when I say technology war between these car companies, what I'm saying is connectivity features and ADAS or autonomous features will be driving a lot of the differentiation, and pricing will cap the ability to make a ton of money per vehicle. Okay, so those two things in the China market, and I think it'll bleed over to a lesser extent to the EU and the United States, because these car companies also don't want to build three different sets of cars. But so the theme is going to be the technology wars between these guys, and then the macro stuff, right? We're talking data security, we're talking chip shortages, we're talking battery capacity issues, we're talking relationship issues between countries and regions, right? I don't want to get too specific, but you know what I'm talking about. That lays right on top of that. And so you have this complete uncertainty. And I think what's worth noting as well, Lei, is maybe WM underestimated their opponents and said, the features that we think will be popular are X, Y, and Z. And then you see XPeng just go over the top and say, we're putting 2 LiDAR. And these other companies follow suit very quickly. We're putting this smart parking feature. And so it had to have taken some of the OEMs by surprise as well, right? Like, oh man, we didn't see this in our roadmap until 2023. And XPeng is already doing it in 2022. So that's the coolest thing, because now everybody's scrambling to figure out, okay, technologically, in integration, hardware software integration, can we pull it in and put it into a feature in our ID4 starting next year? They're doing those types of negotiations and horse trading internally with the engineering, manufacturing, and marketing teams, because they got to be able to market and be competitive in the market with their products. And so the marketing team's always, because I've been in these meetings, is always like, we need every feature today, right? And then the engineering teams are like, well, we need to change X, Y, and Z on our operating system, on our hardware, if we're going to have these features. And then the manufacturing guys are like, you know what? You just have one feature and we'll build 1 million of them, right? So yeah, those internal struggles are interesting to hear. So.
And I'm rooting for actually these traditional companies, big giants, to catch up. But whenever you see things like don't park your Chevrolet Bolt inside a garage, or they had this issue, right? You saw that?
Yep.
And when the Mach-E was going downhill, right? You heard about that as well?
Yes.
When you hear about these, it's just so deflating, right? Oh, you're like, come on, you.
Because you and I think that, for American who's listening, they'll completely understand this. You and I think it's basic blocking and tackling, right? This isn't the cutting edge stuff. This is like just regular firmware operating system stuff, right? And if your battery is unstable, then why do you even have it on the road? This is like roadworthiness. This isn't like, okay, we put the coolest technology in our car and there's a bug, right? This is basic stuff, in my opinion.
Yeah. So
we are at 9:30. So we will open the room up right now to anyone who has any comments or questions. We talked a lot about the foreign automakers today.
Well, good thing we didn't have to talk about Didi, because Didi, it seems they're getting, they were wounded, but it seems like they're slowly crawling back.
Yeah, and
so
it's a numbers game for Didi, right? Because we did see that the competitors are getting more aggressive. Meituan relaunched their ride-hailing platform, which I think they did it in a hurry. So I've been hearing that there's been a lot of wait times and complaints about not being able to get drivers or rides. But I will say that in the last week and a half, I've tried to use Didi right after the SmackDown. It has taken me longer to get Didi. So it has affected them, at least in my experience. And there's at least been another handful of people that I've spoken with that use Didi quite often, and they also see in Shanghai and in Beijing longer wait times. So it has affected them for sure from a customer service standpoint. That brings us to the end of this week's show. Lei and I thank you for tuning in. My name is Tu Lee, and you can find me on Twitter at Sino Auto Insight. That's SinoAutoInsight. You can find Lei on Twitter at LeiXing77. That's LEIXING77. If you wouldn't mind rating and or reviewing us on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you grab your podcast from, we'd appreciate that as well. Even better, if you enjoy this show, please tell your friends about it. Please join us again next week as we track down all the latest news on China, EVs, and more.